If you're looking for a nutrition question that is likely going to send me into a rant, you've definitely hit the nail on the head with this one. This month's Ask a Sports Dietitian question says, why am I not losing weight? I'm only eating 1,200 calories. 1,200 calories. Where do I begin? The 1,200 to 1,400, 1,600 calorie diet phenomenon, like normalization, is probably one of my big bugbears when it comes to nutrition, especially sports nutrition, especially female nutrition and female athletes, females that are doing a lot of sport. You don't have to be an athlete. You could be doing a lot of sport and need a lot more food and energy than this. If we aren't eating enough energy for our daily metabolic needs to stay alive, things start shutting down. Most people need significantly more than 1,200 calories to stay alive and to function healthily normally. Like 1,200 calories is what a toddler needs to eat and to thrive. So an adult is going to need a lot more than this to be thriving and to be functioning healthily. If we aren't eating enough for this, then things shut down and start falling apart. And now, a caveat to this, I have used extreme low calorie weight loss strategies with specific clients. I've used 800 calorie diets with specific clients in specific contexts and situations, but they are doing very little to none activity and exercise, and it's been done for medical purposes. Weight loss is part of that, but there are a lot of other situations and things going on into when and how and why I would recommend that. And it's not a long-term solution. It requires a lot of support and it has a lot of social, psychological kickbacks. For the average person, the average man, the average woman, we need significantly more than 1,200 calories to survive. And having not enough energy actually tends to have more of the opposite effect, because if we aren't having enough energy and the macronutrient support isn't in alignment for that, we might be losing weight, but it's more likely to be coming from muscle mass, even if there's a high protein intake. And there was a really good study that came out a couple of years ago, and they compared women who had like adequate energy availability to low energy availability. And so if we looked at the breakdown, the macronutrient breakdown, there was women that were having 2,400 calories a day versus 1,350 calories per day. Protein wise was pretty similar, around 100 grams per day. Carbohydrate, the women with adequate availability. So I would say very normal carb intake without exercise. In my experience and with the clients and the athletes, people that I've worked with, I would say very normal to eat 200 grams of carbs a day. Very, very normal. You need more to add, and we add more in for exercise. Anyways, the women that were having adequate availability, they were having just over 300 grams of carbs a day. The women in low energy availability were having 145 grams per day. And then fat intake, the women with optimal energy were having 81 grams of fat a day. The women that were in low energy were only having 40 grams of fat per day. And what happened when these women were training and exercising was that the women who had adequate energy and they were doing their strength and their physical sort of training, they gained muscle mass. So they gained weight, but they gained muscle mass, and they supported their metabolic sort of rate. Their resting energy rate didn't drop. However, the women that were eating that 1,300 calories, that was probably below than their metabolic rate, and they're definitely not supporting the training that they were doing, they actually lost about 400 grams of muscle mass. And for me, this raises huge red flags when it comes to, for lots of reasons, but I mean, we don't want to be losing muscle mass typically, but that muscle mass, especially with women, as we're aging, we're getting older, and I see a lot of women in like their 30s, the 40s, the 50s, 60s, going for this and utilizing this, or being encouraged to eat these really restrictive, really low energy diets that are actually having negative outcomes, firstly in the short term, but also in the long term, because that muscle mass, losing 400 grams of muscle mass in 10 days, that's insane. They were slow at repairing and rebuilding muscle. Their metabolic rate went down. And this is if we aren't eating enough just to keep ourselves alive, then yeah, our metabolic rate starts going down because it's shutting off everything that's not non-essential. So I often see people's their hormones being affected, and cholesterol. If we aren't eating enough, for example, like cholesterol levels can go high because you aren't able to distribute that cholesterol adequately around the body because there isn't really an escape route. So the problem is actually not enough food, not enough energy. It's not a case of like, oh, I need to eat less fat. It's like, no, you need to eat a lot more. When I'm seeing people and they're eating these really low calorie calorie, really low energy diets, losing 400 grams of muscle mass within just over a week. That's huge sort of red flag, because it's often the opposite of what people are wanting to achieve. Like, number one reason people come to see me, they want to lose weight. And I'm always like, okay, what are you making that mean? Because is it the number on the scale, or is it aesthetics? Is it physical, how you look, how your clothes fit? Because you could be the exact same weight and be smaller because you've gained muscle and lost fat, or you could lose weight but have lost muscle but retained the fat mass that you have. So body composition plays a big part into that, and the fueling strategies that you use will make a big impact as to how that plays out in your diet. So for me, bare minimum without exercise, I will be using BMR plus 10% plus exercise. And this is with the strictest way to be fueling. And so this is not an approach that I would be using for very few people. I use it with my jockeys and I use it with my boxers. People who have to make weight. If they don't make 60 kilograms, they don't make 54 kilograms, they don't fight, they don't race, they don't compete. They must make that weight. In that situations, we have to be extremely strict and be really rigid. Most people don't need to be that strict. They don't need to be that rigid with their diet. So we typically want to have more than the bare minimum of energy. And always, I want to flip the script. Like, why are we always trying to go for, like, what's the littlest that we can eat? Why don't we, like, flip the script and, like, how can we maximize what we can eat? Not just in terms of macronutrients or, like, count how many burgers can I eat, whatever. It's like, how much quality, like, how much more variety, how can we maximize and eat more and enjoy more from the foods that we're having, versus always being focused on, like, little, less. Going back to BMR, metabolic rate, like plus 10% to keep you alive and functioning. And that tends to count for at least basic moving or walking around the house. But if you aren't meeting your BMR, and the lowest BMR that I've ever had metabolic measured, from whether it's been a DEXA scan or it's been through using a metabolic chamber and having the gas mask, I have never met a man or a woman that's had a BMR below about 1,350. I can't think of anyone I've really met that has had a metabolic rate. And this is metabolic rate just to keep them alive, keep the heart pumping and stuff. So if you're eating less than your metabolic rate and the exercise, the energy that you're living, it's compromising your health, it's compromising your performance. And sometimes you don't see those things straight away. Like, they can take long times to deliver. Like, if you're not eating enough, it affects your mood, it affects your energy levels, it affects your sleep quality, it affects your sugar levels. All these things can be influenced by just not getting enough energy in throughout the day. If there's anything that I can encourage you to do, if you are thinking or you're trying to eat 1,200 calories, these really restrictive eatings, you're probably not eating enough and you probably need to eat more. But this is where timing plays a huge part. It's not just like, oh, cool, I need to eat another 300, 400, 500 calories. Be strategic when you add that food, when you add that energy in, and increase it incrementally. Because when you increase it slowly, your metabolic rate is able to increase and to fire up and get back on track to where it probably should be. If you're not eating enough, your metabolic rate is going to be suppressed. And that's why it seems like no matter what I eat, like, I seem to be gaining weight. It's like, well, because you're probably not eating enough, first of all. So your body is trying to hold on to dear life to keep you alive. When you can reduce that stress, you reduce the cortisol levels, everything else starts to slowly shift into place. Appetite is another measure that can follow. Like, I find that women that have been not eating enough, they're like, I'm just not hungry. We start increasing their food intake, especially around the training. And a couple of weeks later, like, I'm so hungry. Like, I can't even imagine how I was not eating so much beforehand. Like, again, it's just one of these things that gets suppressed when we aren't eating enough. Essentially malnutrition. I've worked in malnutrition for a long time as a dietitian. Firstly, when I was working in malnutrition in oncology, in cancer wards, I was working in malnutrition for the elderly. When people are really sick, when people aren't eating enough for the energy needs, appetite is one of the things that gets suppressed. And so that same thing applies when we're in a sporting context. It's not always a true measure of whether we're eating enough or eating too little. It's worth being aware of, but don't just think because I'm not hungry, I'm eating enough. Like, you might need to be eating more to support your sort of need. The thing with how much do you need to be eating, it depends. Like, I know this is the answer that you don't want to hear, but it's true. It's the honest truth. Like, how much you specifically need is going to depend on your lifestyle, your training, your personal preferences, your metabolic rate. Like, you may have a really high metabolic rate. Like, there was a woman that I trained with years ago when I was doing triathlon, and by all accounts, we should have been the same. But our metabolic rate, what we needed was 200 calories difference. And so if we were to eat the same amount, exactly the same, one of us would be eating too much, perhaps, and one of us might be eating too little on paper. But again, this is where it comes down to the training that you're doing, the intensity of the training. And I find if you start with what you're doing now, look at what you're currently doing and the outcomes that you are currently achieving. Make tweaks and changes. This is where my framework will teach you how to do that. Looking at what you're doing, looking at adding the timing around the training, if you're getting enough energy, enough macronutrients, simplifying things. It really doesn't have to be that complicated. But if you start with what you're currently doing and you make changes from that, you're more likely to be able to stick with these changes for weeks, months, years, which is what leads to those changes being like long-lasting results. If we make a change for a week, for a month, like, it's not necessarily going to last. And I see that happen a lot of times when people go on these strict diets, like, oh, sweet, I've lost weight, amazing. Then they go on holidays and they eat all the foods they've been refusing themselves to eat for the last couple of weeks, and they regain it, and often more. Whereas when you learn to incorporate those foods intentionally in your everyday life, smartly, intentionally including them, being smart with your food choices, then you're less likely to have this yo-yo approach with your food intake and your diet. And you can tweak and adjust, listen to your body, listen to how you are responding, listen to how you are reacting, and find the strategies and approaches that work well for you and where you're currently at. So that's all for today. Like, subscribe, feel your ride, and I will see you next time.